What I wanted to find out next was whether DuPont had done studies of their own that showed similar harmful results. After all, they created the poisonous product. They must have done some research or had some documentation that showed results similar to those of the University of California studies. I knew DuPont had a document depository in Delaware, where their corporate offices were located, which they had created during the crop litigation. They kept millions of documents filed there in a large warehouse building where lawyers could look for whatever they thought they needed for their cases. The depository was intimidating, imposing, huge, poorly organized, at least for us, and very dusty. The first time I walked in, I just wanted to turn around and go home. My only thought was that I could spend 10 years there and still barely make a dent. To make matters worse, this was before the digital age, so all the files were paper files, which meant we had to physically wade through each and every potential page of evidence by hand. There were hundreds of thousands of pages, if not more, that we had to get through. The depository had a librarian on staff whose sole job was to make opposing lawyers' lives miserable. She fit the classic librarian stereotype. Gray hair, a bit frumpy. While she appeared to be kind and accommodating, her real mission was to confuse, mislead, and disarm the opponent. To her, anyone outside the DuPont family was the enemy. While there was an index of documents, it was extremely difficult to understand, unless, of course, you were the one who compiled it. It made little sense to anyone other than the librarian and a handful of DuPont insiders. That was the point. My team consisted of Marjorie Salem and myself. Marjorie, an associate who worked for me, spent endless hours delving into old boxes that had been hidden away for years. We could have sat there endlessly, with no promise of ever coming up with what we were looking for. Nothing was properly labeled or logically filed. There was no rhyme or reason to what was handed over to us, which I suspected was very much by design. This is what is known as a classic document dump. Defendants are required to cooperate by giving you access to their documents, but they aren't required to make it easy. Here you go, you figure it out. Yeah, right. Whenever we asked for a specific document, the librarian's answer was always, no, we don't have that study, or if we do have that study, it might be in this area over here, or did you look over there? And she'd wave her hand in the general direction of more boxes taking up space in the large, dark and dreary warehouse building. Sure, she provided some assistance, but nothing was ever where it was supposed to be. Finally, we realized that if she sent us to the right, we ought to check out whatever was to the left. If she said look up, we should look down. We'd go to wherever she told us to search and begin by looking around the edges, then work our way out and back in again. Odds were that whatever we were looking for, especially if it was the rat studies on benlate or Benamil, we were not going to find it there. And if the studies were there, they weren't going to be clearly labeled rat studies. We did, however, find some in vitro tests and dermal skin transmission studies that proved to be important elements in our case. The in vitro test showed the level of exposure to Benamil at which cells die, and the dermal skin transmission studies showed what percentage of the chemical could permeate human skin. The in vitro test results were good for us because they illustrated that at the very low dose of 22 parts per billion of Benamil, cells die. This is what causes malformations. And the dermal skin transmission studies illustrated that 3% of the amount of the chemical that gets on a person's skin makes its way into their bloodstream. This was solid information and would help our case. But what we really needed to find were those rat studies. As mentioned earlier, the biggest obstacle was the filing index. Documents were not filed in any rational manner. To the contrary, they were intentionally filed in an irrational manner so that critical documents would be nearly impossible to find. It became clear to us that while critical documents were filed in a way that kept them hidden from outsiders, there still had to be a system in place to make sure they were properly mislaid. Otherwise, how would the librarian know how to misdirect us? Shortly before we were about to pack it in, I stumbled across a stack of papers marked Special Luncheon Memos that had several attachments stapled to them. These appeared to be suspiciously out of place, so I began flipping through them, one page after the other. Bingo! Hey, look at this, I shouted across the room to Marjorie. I think I found the rat studies! And I had. They were the studies Robert Staples, the head of toxicology for DuPont, had conducted in 1980 and 1982, cleverly hidden under special luncheon memos where no one else was likely to search. Clearly, we needed to take Staples' deposition. I now felt that we were in a strong enough position to make our case, and it was a good time to pull the trigger and let the show begin. After 3 weeks of combing through hundreds of thousands of pages, I came up with 80,000 pages of relevant material that I wanted to use, and I earmarked it as evidence. When I told the librarian about my needs, she smiled and said, "No problem." I figured they'd send me a bill for the usual 10 cents.